This is Ryan Finkelstein, host of Locked On Mets, and on today's show, I was joined by Mets beat writer Pat Ragazzo. Last time I had him on the show, it was right before the trade deadline, so we talk about what the Mets did at the deadline and how it has played out since, as this team has really struggled the last couple of weeks. We talk about Javier Baez and that trade. We talk about DeGrom's injury, and we talk about this struggling offense and whether the Mets need to make some wholesale changes this offseason.
It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So the last time I talked to Pat Ragazzo, it was right before the trade deadline. And there was a lot of optimism at where the Mets were going and what they might do at the deadline. Before we talk about what's happened since, what were your takes on the trade deadline? For those of you who don't know, Pat Ragazzo, Mets beat writer. Why don't you actually tell them where they can find your work first, and then we'll talk a little bit about the trade deadline.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Ryan, of course, for having me on. As always, it's always a blast to be here. You can find my work at Sports Illustrated and Fan Nation's Inside the Mets website, and then also at my Twitter at Ragazzo Report, Ragazzo Report. So I guess to kind of get right into things, the Mets haven't had a great couple of weeks. They haven't had a great stretch since the last time we talked before the deadline. Of course, I guess we both, I believe, were saying at the time that the Mets, they hung around and they had the 3-month lead in the NL East, and they needed to make moves and be aggressive at the deadline. And well, technically, I guess they did make a big splash with Javier Baez. It wasn't enough, and now Baez is on the IL. But at the same time, the Mets have fallen out of first place. They're 2.5 games back, and they've just played under 500 baseball really for the last 2 months or so. So they were in need of some desperate reinforcements, and they didn't get it. They basically whiffed at the deadline minus Baez, and it's really starting to show up in the last couple of weeks.
When you see a team like the Braves that was able to make a lot of moves within the margins there, they got Jorge Soler, they got a lot of guys that come in, Adam Duvall. The Mets didn't make any of those types of moves where you might have just been adding some extra major league players. You think that was because their roster, they believed in who was in-house? Or was it maybe that there wasn't enough in the farm system when it comes to your BC prospects that they could trade from? It seemed like everybody wanted the Mets' top 10 guys, and maybe beyond that, there might not have been a lot of interest in what else the Mets had to offer.
When it comes down to it, the Mets got bit this year because they lacked that sort of depth in their organization right now and in their farm system. Like you just said, they were going after Jose Barrios and some of the top guys, and in return, teams like the Twins were asking for Ronnie Mauricio and Dom Smith, even major league talent. All these teams wanted their top prospects, and they wound up having to trade last year's first-round pick, Pete Crow Armstrong, just to get Baez and Trevor Williams. So I think that definitely hurt them this year, because then you look over across the city and you see the Yankees getting 2 big boppers in Rizzo and Gallo, and the Yankees really do not have a top-heavy farm system at all, but they have that depth that they were able to make deals for those guys. So when you look at what the Braves did also, and the Phillies, who got Ian Kennedy, and they also got Ian Kennedy and they got Kyle Gibson, and really they kind of loaded up and they didn't give up too much to get those guys, and it's kind of helped out their team in the long run, made them stronger, made them deeper, and kind of padded a little bit of weaker areas on those rosters. And the Mets really weren't able to do that. And really what it comes down to is not only, because you don't just they whiffed, but it's not just they weren't interested or they couldn't offer. They didn't have the depth to do so and add those sort of pieces, and it's really hurting them right now.
Yeah, we talked a lot before the deadline about making a trade that would kind of accomplish all of your needs in one because of that lack of depth. We talked about if you did have to give up one of your big prospects, you hope to get a reliever, a starter, the position player you wanted. They kind of got some of it with Javi Baez and Trevor Williams. Obviously, you couldn't expect that Baez would land on the IL so quickly, although that has been this Mets season. I think that the trade itself, giving up Pete Crow Armstrong, was fine, but was that the best possible package that they could have gotten back, or should they have been maybe trying to shop Pete Crow Armstrong around a little bit more and see what else they could have gotten if they're going to give up that prospect?
That's an interesting way of looking at it. More so what I've heard about that trade is the fact that if the Mets weren't fully going to go for it, which it doesn't look like they did now, of course, because they didn't do enough at the deadline, then why give up last year's 2020 first round pick? Because you're still selling off a very valuable asset in your farm system and at the top of your prospect list for a rental player in Baez, who at this point, it doesn't seem like they're going to lock him up long term after this year. I mean, his approach is not great, and his plate discipline is abysmal, and that's why he leads the league in strikeouts. So I just don't really see how teams could invest long-term dollars in a player like that, especially the Mets, given the state of their offense right now that kind of needs wholesale changes, both from the coaching standpoint, from the hitting aspect, and from a player and talent standpoint. So really, I guess the only situation where that would have been okay is if it were Chris Bryant, who they were giving up Crow Armstrong with, because with that in mind, the Mets actually would realistically be considering signing Chris Bryant to a long-term deal, as they should be now and looking ahead to the offseason. But with Baez, it didn't really make sense. And really the guy, he went 6 for 35 since they picked him up, and then he landed on the IL with the back spasms. So it really hasn't, as bad as it looked then, it looks even worse a couple of weeks later. And add insult to injury, like on that day, it was supposed to be a very positive day of the deadline because they did get, a big name like Javier Baez to potentially come in and help the lineup. And then they found out DeGrom was going to get shut down for 2 weeks. And then fast forward 2 weeks later, and Baez is on the IL, and DeGrom shut down another 2 weeks. So things just haven't gotten better for this Mets team, and that's kind of led to where they are right now.
BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to bet on all of your sports action. Whether it's the NFL season, which is just around the corner, or Major League Baseball, BetOnline has you covered with real-time updated odds and props on almost anything you can imagine. You can bet on Pete Alonso hitting a home run or Marcus Stroman getting 7 strikeouts in a game. It is all there for you at BetOnline, which also has you covered for all the news, scores, and odds. It's the best way to place your bets, and it's free to sign up. So head to the website or use your mobile device to sign up today and receive your 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit with our promo code LOCKEDON. Again, that's promo code LOCKEDON to receive a 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. BetOnline, your online sportsbook experts. One reason to repair and maintain your cars is to save money that you can use for other important things like your mortgage or food. So why would you choose to spend 30%, 50%, maybe even 100% more for the exact same auto parts at a chain store or new car dealership when you could just go to rockauto.com, a family business that's been serving auto parts to customers online for 20 years. They have everything you could want, from engine control modules to brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, even new carpet. Whether it's for your classic or daily driver, get everything you need in a few easy clicks and have it delivered directly to your door. The rockauto.com catalog is unique and remarkably easy to navigate. Quickly see all the parts available for your vehicle and then choose the brand, specifications, and prices you prefer. Go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. Right Locked On in there. How did you hear about us box? So they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think we could definitely talk about DeGrom and how that might have impacted the decisions at the deadline as well. But you touched on something with Javier Baez I want to go back to. You said you don't think he's going to be back next year. To me, I agree that I wouldn't want Javier Baez back considering that plate discipline. But with Francisco Lindor and the fact that they gave up Pete Armstrong, to me, it just seems like there is a pretty good chance that something could get done. But you might be hearing differently. Do you really think that they're going to let him walk? Or is this something where because your best player wants his best friend here, a deal might get done?
Well, so basically right now at this point, I haven't heard anything about what they plan on doing with Baez. I'm just speaking hypothetically to what I think when the organization is evaluating their short and long term, and they already have Lindor locked up to a long-term deal. Yes, he's friends with Lindor. Baez is friends with Lindor, and they would create a very lethal double play combo up the middle. And on the other hand, though, too, on that note, Jeff McNeil is much better at second than he is at third. And at second, he's not even a great glove as it is. So I just think that they wouldn't move if they're keeping McNeil in their long-term plans, it wouldn't really make much sense to move him to third and have Baez play second long-term, just because it strengthens your defense up the middle, which is the most important, but at the same time, it weakens your defense overall, especially in the hot corner. So I don't think Lindor, of course, obviously wants Baez to get signed long-term, but I don't think that's going to influence what the Mets do when it comes down to the offseason, because when they're weighing their options last year now, of course, not going all in for George Springer is looking like also like a blunder as well, considering he's been the hottest hitter really since the end of June, and he would really be uplifting the offense right now. So I don't see Steve Cohen and the Mets and Zach Scott and whoever else they bring in to potentially be the new president of baseball ops, making the same mistake twice, to where, one, they're not going to go hard if they like a hitter who they think could kind of uplift this offense, which is what they should have gotten at the deadline, but it didn't work out. And two, even though they did give up Pico Armstrong, I don't think they're going to do that just to double down, just to sign Baez, just to double down and say, hey, yeah, well, we did this for a reason and we're going to get it. I don't think that's the case, because when you look at Baez and the type of hitter he is, he's not a guy who really consistently, at least, can help this offense kind of find a new identity. And that's not going to help the team next year. It's not going to help the team in the long term, especially since they already have all that money locked up in a middle infielder in Lindor. I just don't see them signing Baez long term. But hey, I mean, I guess anything can happen at this point, and who knows? Baez could come back and he could go on a tear potentially. But just as really speaking from the moment right now of how kind of things are, I guess, shaping up for the offseason.
Yeah, and personally, I agree with you 100%. I mean, especially when you have Brett Beatty and Mark Vientos coming up the pipeline. Yeah. The infield is pretty stacked right now when it comes to their depth overall moving forward. So it doesn't make a ton of sense to spend there. It makes a lot more sense to spend on Chris Bryant, because at least you can move him to the outfield if you had to. Get into the Jacob deGrom element towards this. Do you think that, they find out right before the deadline that deGrom's still in this holding pattern? Could that be another reason why they didn't go all in? And if that is the case, was the trade for Javier Baez simply a move to appease not only the clubhouse, but also the fan base?
Yeah, that's also an interesting aspect there. It's like, is there the factor that maybe, because they admitted they found out about deGrom a couple hours before the deadline, and it didn't change their approach of being more aggressive for pitching after that. So that kind of tells you all you need to know. At the same time, you wouldn't expect them to give up a first-round pick if that were the case, if they really weren't going for it. And then the way it kind of has turned out, it does kind of look like they kind of went after a name and just did something just to appease the fan base. But I don't believe that the front offices operate that way. I know Zach Scott doesn't operate that way. So I think they realistically just got somebody who they thought, one, could fill in for Lindor in his absence and kind of hold down the boat until he comes back. And two, someone that, an exciting, electrifying player who could uplift the offense, could, make an impact on the base paths and defensively with the slick plays and dynamicness that he kind of brings with his glove there in the field. I think they more saw it that way, where they started kind of doing their work and their homework and targeting Baez after Lindor got hurt, just kind of seeing it as, a kind of short-term and potential long-term move for the season as it is. So I just don't think that I know the way it looks, of course, is maybe it was like an appeasal move, but I don't believe that. I don't buy that. But at the same time, it is kind of head scratching that first-round pick, for a guy who is just a rental and maybe not as much of an impact as a Bryant or someone else who was potentially available on the market.
Well, I hope all that got in there. A little bit of technical difficulties, but that'll probably only show up on the YouTube side for the podcast audience. I'm sure that'll all come across fine. So with what you're saying here and where the Mets are right now, this could still work out, right? There's still a chance Javier Baez has a short stint on the IL. He takes off. The Mets find a way back into this race here, but this West Coast trip is looking pretty daunting right now, especially after the Dodgers just swept the Mets at Citi Field. You were at those games, I'm sure. What was the environment like at Citi Field? And, what were your takeaways from the way the Mets played? Because they didn't play terrible baseball early on, but as the series wore on, once again, the problems with runners in scoring position continued to rear their ugly head.
Right. So It was a playoff atmosphere, particularly on Friday night, especially the first game of the series. It was a great atmosphere, and I just was a little confused at the lineup that was put out on Friday. They went with their B squad lineup in arguably the most winnable game against Urias, as opposed to having to face Walker Buehler and Scherzer the next two nights. Granted, they have had success against Scherzer in his career, but at the same time, you just kind of go with the most winnable game on paper. And the first game of any series, especially against a big team like the Dodgers, is stealing that first game, because after that, you're not in danger of being swept. And whatever happens, maybe you win the series, maybe you lose 2 of 3, but the expectations weren't very high. So I saw that game as a must-win game Friday night, specifically, even more so than last night against Scherzer, where they had to avoid the sweep and didn't. But yeah, it was really confusing at why they put out that B squad lineup. And then ironically, the guys who they subbed in, the three of their best hitters who they sat in, McNeil, Dom, and Conforto, came in the 7th and led the charge on the 4-run comeback. So that was really, I guess, telling in that game when those guys came in, and the Mets tied it, and then they weren't able to take the lead. And then fast forward, we go into extra innings, and that was definitely a winnable game. But honestly, the move that they made in the bullpen was head scratching, I should say, in the 10th inning, where they had a well-rested Aaron Loop versus Will Smith, who hasn't hit lefties in his career. He's batting 186 against lefties this year. And instead, the Mets chose to go with Jerry's Familia for a third straight day against Will Smith, who crushes righties. And the move ultimately backfired. He had the 2-run home run, and they lost the first night. Now, obviously, that was a disappointing way to end a game where they had an exciting comeback, but there was a few aspects of that game. It was not going with your A lineup for the first 5 innings. It was James McCann making a throwing error back to the mound in the 6th inning. That allowed the runner to move over to third with 1 out. And the Dodgers are a sac fly and situational hitting machine, and they wound up getting the job done with the sac fly. That was an extra run that made a difference. And then also, of course, the move in the bullpen in the 10th really came back to bite them with using Familia again instead of Loop. It just didn't make sense. And then, of course, on Saturday night, after the first night, it was like, okay, they proved they can hang with the Dodgers. Like, it was very promising, but it didn't guarantee that they were going to win any games of the series. And of course they didn't. But Saturday, it was a pitching duel. Taijuan Walker showed a lot of promise with that great performance. Obviously didn't end the way he would have wanted to, but if he got any kind of run support, he would have easily, kind of cruised to a win. 7 innings, 1 run allowed. Loop came in, got the big strikeout of Bellinger in the 7th. And then obviously Buehler was locked down as well with the 10 strikeouts and just gave up the home run to Conforto, who, by the way, Conforto is heating up, by the way, which is very promising, I guess, as well for the Mets lineup, despite their situational woes. But to have him kind of clicking on all cylinders gives them a little hope offensively. And then second straight night with 10 innings. And by then the Mets bullpen's just been so taxed, and Yennsy Diaz, who's been decent, had to come in the 10th. And that's, of course, when Bellinger got to him, and then they took the lead. And the Mets very much had their chance to come back in that game, or at least tie it with a runner in scoring position in the 10th. And they're trotting out like Brandon Drury, who's had some big hits for this club, granted, but they're relying on a hitter like that in way too many big spots, which has also been the problem this season. And of course, they wound up losing in that game. They couldn't even get the tying run in the 10th when they had their chances, 0 for 3 and run in the scoring position. And then last night was just a total beatdown. Carlos Carrasco's really been bad in 3 out of 4 of his starts for the Mets. I know he had only the 1 inning in his last start before last night, but his stuff just hasn't looked the same. He said it himself in the postgame. Like, he still feels like he's in the end of spring training, given how much time he's missed. And that hurts the Mets even more, especially with DeGrom out. So that was just kind of, the Mets needed a big performance. They got 2 really good pitching performances in the first 2 nights. And by the way, Tyler McGill showed a lot of grit for what he did on Friday night, especially with the 32 pitch first inning where he struggled, and the Dodgers had their chances to have big innings, and he kept them. He kept the Mets in the game. He prevented any big innings. He gave up runs, scattered 3 runs, and he fought through 5 innings despite having the high pitch count. And he would have went into the 6th if they didn't pinch hit for him in the bottom of the 5th when they had 2 runners on. But Tyler McGill deserves credit. Taijuan Walker deserves credit. Fast forward to the Sunday night game, as I was saying, the Mets just couldn't come through with runners in scoring position all series. They couldn't even get sac flies for the most part. Which, by the way, they're like one of the bottom teams in the league for sac flies. They only had, I think they had their 14th sac fly of the season last night, which is abysmal considering we're 117, 118 games into the season. So it just kind of tells you the whole story right there. But of course, Scherzer shut them down for the most part, the 2 runs. The Mets did have their chances. They had the bases loaded a couple times with less than 2 outs, and all they could get were RBI ground outs. And they tied their 0 for 12 with runners in scoring position streak, which is the most for any MLB team this year. And the Mets were the ones who set it on July 16th against the Pirates, and then they tied it last night again. And they wound up finishing 2 for 29 in the series with runners in scoring position, which kind of tells you all you need to know, I guess, of how everything's been going. And it's definitely disappointing for after sweeping the Nationals, showing some signs of life, and then getting swept again for the second straight weekend. They're not going to survive too many more sweeps. With this upcoming stretch coming now in San Francisco and then having to go to LA to face the Dodgers again, this could very much bury their season. And with the way it's going, there's no signs that they're going to turn it around. And just last night was just another example where they got blown out and they got a little closer, and then the Dodgers just kept taking advantage. That's why they're the Dodgers. That's why they're a good team, and they're a very good hitting team. And the Mets just don't do the same things. Like, the Dodgers made mistakes and the Mets didn't capitalize. Whereas on the other hand, anytime the Mets made a mistake in the series, the Dodgers were the ones capitalizing, sac flies, big hits, doubles, home runs, whatever it may be. And that just kind of makes the difference between good and bad team.
Do you love to order fish when you go out to eat but never make it for yourself at home? Cooking restaurant quality dishes at home starts with high quality seafood and simple techniques from Wild Alaskan Seafood. Wild Alaskan Company delivers high quality, sustainably sourced wild caught seafood right to your door. Each shipment contains premium wild caught, individually wrapped portions of delicious seafood that's ready to prepare and easy to cook. Wild Alaskan Company seafood is how nature intended it to be. Always wild, never farmed or modified, and it contains no antibiotics. You can adjust, pause, or cancel your membership anytime, and they offer 100% satisfaction guaranteed or your money back. And right now you can get $15 off your first box of premium seafood when you visit wildalaskancompany.com/MLB. That's wildalaskancompany.com/MLB for $15 off your first box. wildalaskancompany.com/MLB. Make sure to use that URL to let them know that we sent you. Yeah, 100%. And I think what we're seeing throughout, really most of this year, they played over their heads in May. It's been a 500 ball club. And, that's just the reality of what this team has been. And I think that the big frustration is you have all of these homegrown guys who just have had down years all at once here. And I do think that this is kind of a make or break point for all of them right now. There's all this talk about camaraderie, how great the clubhouse is. If these guys don't come together in this final month here, how can you go into another season saying, yeah, we'll continue with Dom in left and JD at third and rolling this group back out and let's bring Conforto back? I feel like if things don't change soon, there might be some wholesale changes in the offseason where some of these guys will stay, of course, but you're going to select a few that have really performed, like Brandon Nimmo and Pete Alonso, and the rest of them, I think there's going to be a lot of conversation about what the Mets do as they try to reshape this team for 2022.
Right. So you hit it right on the head. With anything where you're trying to have success in any aspect or any area, if you do the same thing over and over and over and over again, and it's not working and you expect the same result, then that's absolutely insane. And I don't believe the Mets will be doing that next year. I think that there's going to be, with besides beyond a select few positions, maybe Pete Alonso, Jeff McNeil, Lindor, McCann, and Nimmo. Other than that, the Mets need to be looking for upgrades in the corner outfield spots, third base, and they need to have just a whole offensive overhaul, because I think this year pretty much proved that they're not going to win with this core. They very much could and will win potentially with some of the bigger names that they have, like some of the guys who have had good seasons, but maybe still a little bit down from what we're used to, such as Pete Alonso or Jeff McNeil. But at the same time, the Mets do need some wholesale changes, and they cannot go into next year with the same lineup or the same, majority core that they have this season and just expect bounce backs from everyone, who had their down years this year. And I don't believe that they will. I think the way these organizations kind of evaluate player performance is they head into each season with who's a bounce back candidate, who's not, where XYZ, and they're going to basically have to take a very long and hard look at pretty much every player in this lineup and say the same thing and find out who's a bounce back candidate and who's not for next year. And regardless, it shouldn't stop them from being aggressive and trying to make changes and overhaul to this lineup, because again, they can't just do the same thing next year and expect different results. Yes, they need a whole overhaul in the coaching staff as well and the approach, because it's been terrible since they got rid of Chili Davis, and it wasn't good with Chili Davis before them. But at the same time, it's the players as well. The players are not capitalizing. They're not, they're looking for their pitches and they're swinging at it and they're fouling it back. They're getting hangers. They're getting balls middle of the plate. A-Rod was saying it last night on the broadcast too, and love him or hate him, but he was right, and he knows the game. Dom Smith got an 88-mile-per-hour pitch, middle of the plate with the bases loaded and 1 out in the first, and he fouled it off. And A-Rod was like, how do you not hit that pitch? And it's just kind of been the story all year, where we hear Luis Rojas say that they're not capitalizing off fastballs. And yes, the Mets have capitalized a little bit more off fastballs since the National Series, but at the same time, like, they're getting those mistakes and they're just not hitting their pitches. And that's kind of also been led to the offensive struggles as well. So what do you do then? You don't just expect everyone to just turn it around next year. You got to bring in new guys who are going to hit those pitches, who are going to be consistent and are going to improve this team. And that's the way that they got to go about it.
Yeah, it is. And right now, this is your last chance. If you're that core, if you love playing with each other and everything else, here it is. Go win the division. But I think the way things have kind of played out, it seems a little bit unlikely that the Mets are going to go through this stretch on the West Coast and come out of it without being in a big hole in the National League East. And then you got about a month of the season left after that. So it's going to be really tough for this team. Thanks again for joining me. You can follow him on Twitter at Ragazzo Report, and you can find all the great work he's doing, and talk to you again soon.
Yeah. Likewise. Thanks so much for having me on, Ryan. It was a blast.